Good evening, and settle in for a quiet night as we drift back in time. Welcome to History Sleepy, where the past is always peaceful. Please take a moment to subscribe for more relaxing tales. Let's start our journey. Right then, regarding point number 4 on the agenda, which pertains, as the record indicates, to the Serpent Queen's return, it is important, for the sake of thoroughness, to establish the context within which this particular event, designated as Item 4, occurred. This was not, it must be stressed, a sudden or unexpected happening, though the precise timing, down to the hour, was subject to the usual variables associated with river travel and the prevailing atmospheric conditions of the late autumn season in that specific region. The initial administrative notation concerning the possibility of the Serpent Queen's return appears in Ledger Entry 7B, subsection Travel and Logistics, potential, dated 3 months prior to the actual event. This entry, penned by scribe Elara, whose handwriting was noted for its consistent, if somewhat unremarkable, clarity, merely states, query received from Western Outpost regarding potential return of Subject Alpha as designation for Serpent Queen in internal documents. Awaiting confirmation. File under pending. The ink used was standard issue, iron gall, sourced from the usual supplier in the lower district, a Mr. Boren, known primarily for the reliable, if slightly acidic, quality of his product. Confirmation, when it eventually arrived, was conveyed via courier, a young man named Thomas, whose primary characteristic, according to the quartermaster's log, was his ability to remain seated on a horse for extended periods without complaint. The dispatch itself was brief, written on a single sheet of medium-grade parchment, sealed with the standard, non-ceremonial wax of the Western Outpost Administration. It simply read, Subject Alpha departing via river barge, estimated arrival within 10-14 days, weather permitting. Prepare standard reception protocols. Now, the standard reception protocols for a returning dignitary of this level were, it must be said, rather well established and, frankly, repetitive. They involved, primarily, the allocation of specific resources and the scheduling of personnel for various mundane tasks. For instance, the head of palace cleaning, a diligent woman named Agnes, was instructed to ensure that the main receiving hall, specifically the area around the third pillar from the left, when facing north, was free of dust. This particular pillar, it is worth noting, was constructed of local grey stone, quarried some decades prior from the hills to the east, and possessed no unique carvings or features of interest. Its surface was, on average, slightly rough to the touch. Furthermore, the quartermaster was tasked with ensuring that a sufficient supply of dried biscuits and lukewarm water was available in the antechamber adjacent to the receiving hall. The biscuits were of the standard military ration type, hard, square, and nutritionally adequate, but entirely devoid of flavour. The water, drawn from the palace well, was tested weekly for purity, a process that involved dipping a small lead weight on a string into the water and observing the rate at which it descended, among other equally fascinating procedures. The river barge itself, designated Riverine Vessel 3, was a flat, bottomed craft of typical construction for the region, designed for stability rather than speed. Its hull was painted a dull brown, a colour chosen for its practicality in concealing river mud. The journey, as recorded in the vessel's log, a separate document, bound in plain leather, was largely uneventful. Day 1 saw calm waters and a light headwind. Day 2 continued calm waters. Day 3 slightly stronger headwind, requiring minimal adjustment to the sail angle, and so on. The log meticulously records the consumption of fuel, dried river reeds, bundled, the preparation of meals, mostly boiled root vegetables and salted fish, and the nightly mooring points along the riverbank, which were, without exception, indistinguishable from one another, a patch of reeds, a few trees, the gentle slope of the bank. There were no storms of note, no encounters with river pirates, or rare occurrence in that stretch of the river anyway. No sightings of unusual wildlife. Beyond the expected waterfowl and occasional, distant deer, the days simply passed, marked by the slow, steady rhythm of the river current against the hull, and the gradual shift of the sun across the sky. Back at the palace, the waiting continued. Scribe Alara continued his work on other ledgers, meticulously recording grain yields and tax collections. Agnes supervised the dusting, ensuring that even the tops of door frames were attended to. The quartermaster checked and re-checked his inventory of biscuits and water barrels. The air in the palace was still, punctuated only by the distant sounds of daily life, the clatter of pots from the kitchens, the low murmur of conversations in other wings, the occasional creak of aging timber. And then, on the 14th day, precisely as estimated by the courier Thomas's dispatch, allowing for a slight margin of error, Riverine Vessel 3 was sighted approaching the palace dock. The arrival was quiet. There was no fanfare, no trumpets, no crowds lining the banks. The dockmaster, a man named Gregor, who had held the position for 17 years, and whose primary concern was the secure tying of mooring ropes, was present. A few palace guards stood by, their posture relaxed, their expressions neutral. The barge nudged gently against the dock. A gangplank, made of sturdy, unvarnished wood, was extended, and the Serpent Queen, designated Subject Alpha, disembarked. She was accompanied by 2 attendants, whose names are not recorded in any significant document. The process of disembarking was slow and deliberate, one foot placed carefully in front of the other, the slight adjustment of clothing, the brief, non-committal nod to the dockmaster, and then she walked towards the palace entrance. The path was paved with smooth, grey stones, recently swept by Agnes's team. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The walk took approximately 3 minutes and 15 seconds. According to a minor functionary who happened to glance at the large, powered clock in the courtyard at that precise moment. Upon entering the receiving hall, she paused briefly near the 3rd pillar from the left, which, thanks to Agnes's efforts, was indeed free of dust. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no immediate calls to action. The standard reception protocols were observed. A cup of lukewarm water was offered and politely declined. A plate of dried biscuits remained untouched on a nearby table. And that, in essence, was the return. Item number 4. A logistical process recorded in ledgers, executed according to standard procedures, and notable primarily for its complete lack of noteworthy incident or excitement. The river flowed. The dust settled elsewhere. The biscuits remained hard. And the Serpent Queen was, once again, present within the palace walls. The administrative wheels continued to turn, much as they had before, and would continue to do so long after. The Serpent Queen's entry into the palace complex was logged in the appropriate registers, a simple line item among many detailing the comings and goings of various individuals of rank or service. Her presence did not precipitate any immediate or discernible alteration in the established routines. The same courtyards were swept with the same brooms by the same individuals at the same times of day. The same corridors were patrolled by guards, whose footsteps echoed with the same measured cadence. The administrative machinery, a complex arrangement of scribes, clerks, and minor officials, continued its slow, deliberate operation. Consider, for instance, the daily process of document handling. Incoming scrolls, tied with plain cord, and bearing seals of varying, but generally unremarkable significance, would arrive at the outer receiving office. There they would be sorted by a junior clerk, a task involving the careful separation of bundles, the breaking of seals, a small, quiet snap, and the initial, cursory examination of the contents to determine the appropriate internal destination. This sorting was not a rapid affair. It involved concentration, the steady movement of hands, and the occasional adjustment of spectacles. Once sorted, the scrolls would be placed into designated wooden trays, which would then be carried at a moderate pace by messengers along specific, well-trodden routes within the palace to the relevant departmental offices. In these offices, the scrolls would be received by other clerks, logged into large leather, bound ledgers using quills dipped in ink from small ceramic pots, and then placed into yet more trays for review by slightly higher ranking officials. This entire process, from arrival to initial review, could consume a significant portion of the morning, unfolding with a predictable lack of urgency or surprise. The content of these scrolls rarely deviated from the expected: reports on grain yields in distant provinces, requests for minor allocations of resources, updates on the progress of slow, moving construction projects, or routine diplomatic correspondence devoid of any pressing matters. Days unfolded into weeks with a consistent, unvarying rhythm. The sun traversed the sky, its path shifting subtly with the slow turning of the seasons, a change noted more by the gradual alteration in the quality of light filtering through the palace windows than by any sudden shift in temperature or weather, which tended towards prolonged periods of sameness. Meals were prepared and consumed at the appointed hours, the menus varying little from one day to the next, featuring the same staple grains, the same types of dried or preserved provisions, the same hard biscuits. Conversations, when they occurred, tended to revolve around predictable topics: the state of one's health, the minor difficulties of managing staff, the unchanging nature of the tasks at hand. There were no sudden alarms, no unexpected visitors bearing tidings of great import, no spontaneous gatherings of consequence. The dust continued its quiet accumulation on surfaces, requiring the regular, unhurried efforts of the cleaning staff. The river outside continued its indifferent flow towards the sea, its surface occasionally disturbed by a passing leaf or a gentle ripple, but otherwise presenting a picture of persistent, unhurried movement. The Serpent Queen was present, yes, but her presence seemed merely another element in the established, unchanging tableau. Much like the enduring stones of the palace itself, or the predictable cycle of day and night. Life within the palace walls continued, marked not by events, but by the steady, monotonous passage of time and the repetition of the ordinary. Life within the palace walls continued, marked not by events, but by the steady, monotonous passage of time and the repetition of the ordinary. The ordinary, for instance, manifested itself each morning in the slow, predictable creep of sunlight across the flagstone floors of the lesser corridors. This was not a sudden burst of illumination, but a gradual expansion, a barely perceptible brightening that advanced centimetre by centimetre, hour by hour. Within these slowly widening shafts of light, countless dust motes, suspended in the still, cool air, performed their silent, aimless drift. Their movement was dictated by currents too subtle to feel, a constant, unremarkable dance that had no beginning and no end, merely an ongoing state of being. At a certain, predictable point in this slow progression of light, a figure would appear at the far end of the corridor. It would be one of the many servants, indistinguishable in their simple, grey tunics, moving with a practised, unhurried gait. Their purpose was always the same: to perform a simple, repetitive task. Perhaps it was the sweeping of the floor with a worn broom, the bristles whispering against the stone in a sound that was as constant and unchanging as the stones themselves. Or perhaps it was the wiping down of a long, wooden bench, the cloth moving back and forth in a steady, rhythmic motion. The task was performed without variation, without haste, merely the fulfillment of a requirement that had existed for as long as anyone could remember, and would continue to exist for the foreseeable future. The servant would complete their task, slowly, methodically, and then retreat back down the corridor, their footsteps fading into the pervasive quiet. The light would continue its slow, indifferent journey across the floor. The dust motes would continue their aimless drift, and the corridor would return to its state of quiet, unchanging existence. This cycle, the slow movement of light, the silent dance of dust, the brief, predictable appearance of a servant performing a repetitive task, was not a sequence of events, but merely the ongoing state of things. It was the rhythm of the palace, a rhythm defined by its lack of variation, a steady, monotonous pulse that beat on, day after day, year after year, within the enduring, unchanging walls. The air itself seemed thick with this sameness, carrying the faint, constant scent of old stone, beeswax polish, and the distant, muted sounds of other repetitive tasks being performed in other parts of the vast, unchanging structure. Nothing changed, nothing happened, time merely passed, marked only by the slow, predictable shift of light and shadow, and the quiet performance of routine duties. The quiet performance of routine duties continued. In one corner of a vast, sparsely furnished chamber, a figure moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, guiding a soft, well-worn cloth across the surface of a long, dark table. The task was dusting, a task performed at the same time, on the same surfaces, every single day. The cloth moved back and forth, covering the polished wood in overlapping, methodical strokes. There was no thought behind the movement, only the ingrained habit of repetition. The fine layer of dust, which had settled uniformly since the previous day's cleaning, was gathered by the cloth, leaving the surface momentarily clearer before the slow, inevitable process of settling began anew. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of old beeswax polish, a smell that had permeated the structure for generations, hung in the still air. The light from the high, narrow windows shifted with glacial slowness, the angle of the sun changing by a degree over the course of many minutes, causing the dust motes, suspended in the shafts of light, to shimmer and fade, without pattern or purpose. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic swish of the cloth against the wood, and the distant, muffled echoes of other, equally repetitive tasks, being carried out elsewhere within the unchanging walls. Time did not rush, it merely unfolded, hour after hour, marked only by the gradual dimming of the light, as the sun completed its predictable arc across the sky, and the unwavering continuation of the same, simple, unvarying duties. Nothing changed. Nothing was expected to change. The dusting continued. The soft, greyish linen cloth moved back and forth across the surface of the long, dark wooden table. It was a slow, steady motion, a simple sweep from left to right, then back from right to left. The surface was already quite clean, as it had been dusted many times before, and would be dusted many times again. There was no visible accumulation of dust, merely the faint, almost imperceptible film that settled constantly, relentlessly, in the still air. The hand holding the cloth moved with practiced, unthinking regularity. It did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. The table was long. The movement continued, back and forth, left to right to left. The sound was minimal. A faint whisper of fabric against wood, barely audible above the ambient silence of the room. After what felt like a considerable, though unmeasured, period of time spent on the table, the hand, still holding the cloth, moved slowly towards a nearby shelf. The transition was not abrupt. It was a gradual shift in focus, a slow turning of the body, a few deliberate steps. The shelf held a row of identical, unadorned ceramic pots. Each pot required the same attention. The cloth was applied to the smooth, cool surface of the first pot. A circular motion this time, around the body of the pot, then a careful swipe across the rim. Then the next pot, and the next. Each one the same as the last. Each one requiring the same slow, methodical application of the cloth. Outside the window, the light had shifted slightly. The angle of the sun, now lower in the sky than it had been earlier, cast longer, fainter shadows across the floor. The quality of the light was softer, less direct. This change was not sudden. It had been happening continuously, imperceptibly, for hours. It was merely an observation, a fact of the day's slow progression, not an event of any consequence. The dusting of the pots continued. The process was repeated for each pot, the same circular motion, the same swipe of the rim, pot after pot. The hand did not tire noticeably. The mind did not wander significantly. There was little to wander towards. The task filled the available attention with its simple, repetitive demands. The row of pots was long. The dusting continued along the row, one pot, then the next, then the next. The light outside continued its slow, predictable transformation. The air remained still. The silence remained unbroken, save for the faint whisper of the cloth. Finally, the last pot in the row was dusted. The hand paused for a moment, a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. Then, without haste or change in demeanour, it moved towards a small, wooden stool nearby. The stool also required dusting. The process began anew. The cloth moved across the flat seat of the stool, then down the legs, back and forth, up and down. The same slow, steady rhythm, the same lack of urgency, the same absence of any notable event. The dusting of the stool continued. The light outside continued to fade, slowly, predictably. The air remained still. The routine remained unbroken. Nothing changed. Nothing was expected to change. The dusting continued. The dusting continued. The cloth, a simple square of faded grey fabric, moved back and forth across the worn surface of the stool seat. Each stroke was deliberate, unhurried, covering the same ground repeatedly. A final pass was made along the edge, tracing the curve of the wood, then another, ensuring no speck remained. Not that any significant specks had been present to begin with. The surface was already clean, merely undergoing the ritual of maintenance. The movement slowed, the hand guiding the cloth pausing mid, air for a fraction of a second that felt longer than it was. Then, the hand lowered the cloth slowly towards the floor beside the stool. The fabric settled onto the bare wooden planks with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh of displaced air, a sound that was swallowed instantly by the pervasive silence. The hand released its grip. The fingers uncurled, one by one, without haste, straightening slowly. The person stood still for a moment. The air in the room did not stir. It felt heavy with its own stillness. The silence remained complete, save for the distant, barely audible hum of existence that was always there, unnoticed, unchanging. The light outside had faded a little more, the transition from late afternoon to early evening proceeding at its predictable, unvarying pace. The shadows had deepened slightly in the corners, elongating themselves across the floor, but the change was so gradual as to be practically invisible in real time, requiring sustained observation over a long period to register. The person's gaze drifted slowly across the room. It passed over the plain wooden table, the simple straight-backed chair, the single shelf holding a few unremarkable objects, a smooth stone, a small, empty clay pot, a folded piece of paper. Nothing on these surfaces demanded immediate attention. They were as they had been moments before, and as they would likely be moments hence. Yet, the routine dictated the next step. The hand that had held the cloth now reached out towards the table. Slowly, deliberately. The cloth lay waiting on the floor, a small grey patch against the brown wood. The hand paused in its slow arc. Then, with the same lack of urgency that governed all movement here, it bent down to retrieve the cloth. The fingers closed around the soft, familiar material. The cloth was lifted from the floor. The movement was smooth, unhurried, a continuation of the slow rhythm that defined the space. The hand, holding the cloth, began to move towards the table. The process of dusting the table was about to commence. It would be much like the dusting of the stool. Slow, repetitive, utterly without incident. The light continued to fade, the room growing incrementally dimmer, a change so slow it was almost impossible to perceive its progress. The air remained still. The routine remained unbroken. Nothing changed. Nothing was expected to change. The dusting of the table would begin. A cloth was procured. It was a simple cloth, woven from unremarkable fibres, likely cotton or a similar material. Its colour was a faded grey, the result of countless previous uses and washings, none of which had left any discernible mark or pattern upon its surface. It lay folded neatly nearby, a rectangular shape resting inertly on a different, equally unremarkable surface. A hand, moving with deliberate, unhurried slowness, reached out towards the cloth. The fingers closed around a portion of the fabric. The cloth was lifted. It offered no resistance. It simply came away from the surface it had been resting upon. The hand held the cloth for a moment, suspended in the still air. Then the hand, still moving slowly, brought the cloth towards the edge of the table that was to be dusted. The edge of the cloth made contact with the surface of the table. The table's surface was smooth, or perhaps not entirely smooth, but smooth enough that no significant texture was immediately apparent to the touch of the cloth. The cloth rested there for a brief, uneventful interval. Then the hand began to move the cloth. The movement was horizontal, parallel to the edge of the table. It was a slow, steady glide. The cloth moved across the surface. As it moved, it encountered the fine layer of dust that had accumulated there over time. The dust was disturbed. It did not fly dramatically into the air. Some particles adhered to the cloth. Other particles were simply pushed along the surface by the movement of the cloth. The process was quiet. There was no sound of scraping, only the faintest whisper of fabric against wood, a sound so low it was barely perceptible, and certainly not interesting. The cloth continued its slow journey across the small section of the table. It covered a small area, then another small area adjacent to the first. The hand guided the cloth with consistent, unvarying pressure. The dust was removed from the surface in a gradual, systematic manner. The light continued to fade, the room growing incrementally dimmer, a change so slow it was almost impossible to perceive its progress. The air remained still. The routine remained unbroken. Nothing changed. Nothing was expected to change. The dusting of the table continued, one slow, uneventful pass of the cloth following another. The cloth, a simple piece of worn linen, glided across the smooth, cool surface of the table. It picked up no discernible particles, for the table had been dusted many times before, and the air in the room was remarkably still, carrying little in the way of airborne debris. The hand guiding the cloth moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm, a motion practiced over countless repetitions. Back and forth it went, covering the same area, then shifting slightly to overlap the previous path. The light filtering through the window continued its slow transformation, the angle of the sun outside having shifted by an immeasurable amount, resulting in a subtle alteration of the shadows cast by the edges of the table. The quality of the light was now perhaps a fraction softer, or perhaps merely different in a way that defied easy description. The air remained motionless, undisturbed by any breeze or draught. The only sound was the faint, almost inaudible whisper of the cloth against the wood, a sound that was itself monotonous and unchanging. The process continued. Another pass of the cloth, then another. The table remained clean. The cloth remained in the hand. The hand continued its work. The room remained quiet. The light continued its slow, gradual fading. Nothing happened quickly. Nothing happened unexpectedly. The dusting continued, pass after pass, in the quiet, unchanging room. The surface of the table offered no resistance, no variation in texture or temperature that might break the rhythm. It was simply there, a flat expanse of polished wood, waiting to be dusted, and then dusted again. The hand moved. The cloth followed. The wood remained. The light continued its slow descent towards a deeper shade of grey. And now, as the echoes of this incredibly uneventful history fade into the quiet of the night, let the gentle stillness embrace you. May the tranquility of these bygone days guide you into a deep and peaceful slumber. Sleep well.